Right, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to get our player pawn and whatever, third person character, as mine is, and we want to just make sure that we're spawning in a skeleton at the start of the game onto the character at the specified socket, i.e. the hands. We want to make sure that we're doing that as soon as the game begins. So if you just hop into your construction script, and you will see these few nodes here. What these few nodes do is they essentially create the add a skeletal mesh component with a set location and scale, rotation. Obviously they're essentially just parameterizing it. Um, and if you drag off this node, you would be able. Well, in fact, you don't even need to drag off. What you just do is you just right click and you have to hit the promote to variable option, which would come up. And then you would essentially set your gun reference, attach the component, i.e. a scene component, and then reference the skeletal mesh. So I'm going to delete this and try and start this over. In fact, I'm just going to duplicate it even. No. So in fact, what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to unhook these and show you how I got them in like that, because I needed to drag something in as the skeletal mesh from the content browser. So what we'll do is we will drag off the construction script and we will type in. In fact, we're not even typing anything in. We're just going to split our screens up, go into our content browser, look for the gun, the skeletal mesh. It has to be a skeletal mesh, otherwise this method will not work. So we look for AK, and you see here I've got a skeletal mesh. The skeletal mesh, we just drag it straight in. Whatever your gun is called, the skeletal mesh of it, you have to have the skeleton for it. The skeletal mesh, sorry, skeleton and the skeletal mesh. Ideally, for this to work. If you manage to find a way to work, congratulations. The method that I use requires you to reference specific sockets for you to spawn projectiles out of. So yeah, you would just drag that in, and let's just move this up, and you'll get the relative transform and do make transform. What the construction script is that it basically, as I say here, it spawns the gun in game world on start, and that means that when the game begins, um, it will spawn in the skeletal mesh component, which we've referenced as the AK, and then it will give it it'll give it this transform, and we'll make an object reference from it in the event graph. So we can now reference this specific thing through a variable, through an object variable of an actor. Sorry, not of an actor, of a skeletal mesh. So what we'll do is we right click and we click promote to variable, and we set up this variable and we call it AK. So well, yes, so that's already been set. And then off of the um, off of the blue execute pin, off the blue pin there, we'll just drag up and look up attach to component. There's two types here. It asks if we want the first one or the second one. We want the second one. We want it to be a scene component. We want to be adding it to a scene component. It's the only way it'll work. And then what you got is you've got these two pins here that need filling out. Keep the location, rotation, scale at default. Leave this boolean ticked. You drag out the mesh and you place it into the editor, into the event graph, sorry, and you hook it up to the parent. And then you define a socket. Now, what you need to do is you need to look up the skeleton tree, even for your player character. In our case, or my case even, mine happens to be on the, if I just look up skeleton, character skeleton, oh, that's the AK skeleton, I'm not sure why that's opened. Bear with me. Yeah, as you can see on my skeleton, I've added a socket. Now, how do I add a socket? Well, when you add a socket, you just right click the bone, and you say like mine's hand, mine is located here. So you just right click and to the hand. We can just try it with the left hand even. We can experiment a little bit here. So hand left, add a socket, hand L socket, and we attach a gun to that. So and we add a preview asset and we click our AK. And what do you know? It spawned very, very weirdly. So yeah, obviously it's just a preview. We just hit the delete button there, and that'll go away. But mine's you see where mine is added on the skeleton. Everybody will have a different place of where they're putting theirs, I assume, or how they're going to hold them. Again, it's all relative to each person. So you get your weapon socket and you copy the name. And by copying the name, you put it into the socket name here. So you're giving it a socket name to attach this specific AK skeleton to, and you can now reference that in editor. So now that we've got all of that set up, we want to get rid of this, and we want to close down our skeletons. We're not using them, and actually, character skeleton. Yeah, okay, that's gone. Yeah, we want to jump into into the event graph for our game. And as you can see, I have two separate lots of nodes here. Pay no attention to that. Right, so what's going to happen, as you can see here, here's the overview of what's going on here. I'm firing my weapon. I'm firing my weapon when I press the input key, which is obviously set through the mappings in the project settings. It's set a timer by an event called full auto, and essentially what that does is it creates a custom event with a timer, and then it runs a line trace by channel every 0.1 seconds. And when we press it, once it sets that timer, it also sets a boolean called is shooting to true, and then it runs a branch and checks the line trace by channel. So it runs a line trace by channel as well, and we'll feed it this information as to where and start the end line trace by channel. So as to where it's as to where the end line trace channel. What we'll do here is I will duplicate this setup, and here's I will duplicate the setup. Will this let me do it? Nope, of course not. Why would it? So with the fire gun, what we want to do is the input action fire gun. So if you go to your project settings and you can define something, but you don't even necessarily have to do that. You can actually just use a separate. You can just use something separate. You could call whatever you want. You can type up, I don't know, like left mouse button, and it will give you the same thing. It will just make this easier to call this fire command, and modularize it, make it more modular, and allow me to access that almost whenever. That's all. Scripting is. You're just making your work more modular, so you can replicate most of it elsewhere. And the more efficient it is, the better it is. The more you can, call microtasks and so on and so forth, and macros, etc. But yeah, with the input action fire, what we want to do is when we press this, we want to set a timer by event, right? We want to set this timer by event. When we set this timer by event, we want to set our boolean called is shooting, right? So we will set is shooting to true, and whenever we set a timer for a new event called add custom event, we'll call it full auto. Sorry, we'll just call it AK fire. Yeah, AK-47 fire. AK-47 fire. Right. AK fire. Yeah, we'll just call it AK fire for now. So yeah, we call that a custom event, whatever we want. For mine, it's called AK Fire. So when we press this button, it should set a timer for a new custom event called AK Fire. It sets a boolean called is shooting to um, true, and then off of this we want to. Sorry, let's just pull this in a little bit, make a bit more room. We'll get a branch to do a check to see that if shooting is true. Now note here how my is shooting is set to is set to false. So when the game begins, my player isn't shooting already. So with the branch and with the when we run this check on the boolean, when we run the check with this boolean to see if it's true. If it's true, we want to do a line trace by channel. We want to do a line trace by channel, and on the line with the line trace by channel we want to feed in this AK fire to it as well, right? Because every time what's going on here with the set timer by event and this linking back into there is we're essentially setting a timer for a new custom event, and with this custom event, with whatever time we give it, we want it to run this node every so like whatever time we define, however many, like, you know, however quickly we want it to. So with the time, let's set it to 0.1. That's sufficient enough for an AK-47. It's going to go pretty fast and hit you pretty hard, more than a 5.56 would. So that's where we start off with. So with the timer, we want to be able to reset this as well. So what happens when we release is that we want this timer itself, we want this timer, AK fire, to reset whenever we release. So what we do is we drag off the return value pin here and we look up reset, clear and invalidate timer by handle, and we plug that into the release because obviously we want that to happen when we release it, right? So once we do that, we want to do the opposite of is shooting because we're not shooting anymore once we've released. So what we do is we look for set is shooting to false. And as of now, as of how it stands, is the input, you know, every time we press the fire button, it'll set a timer for a new custom event called AK Fire, and when we release, it will clear and invalidate that timer, so it'll stop that function from happening, basically. We want to, so obviously when we press the button, when we press the fire button, we also want to set the boolean called is shooting to true, and when we're going to do a boolean check via a branch, and say that obviously as it says if the condition is true, execution goes to true, otherwise it goes to false. If it's true, we run a line trace by channel every 0.1 seconds, and if it's false, we just repeat it until it's true. So we'll be able to. It's not going to be able to line trace unless the is shooting is set to true, and the only way is shooting is set to true is obviously if you're pressing the fire button, which is defined as the left mouse button. So with that in mind, let's actually look at getting the inputs for the line trace by channels. This is essentially where do we want it to start and where do we want it to end. So with the start, what you want to do is you want to grab your follow camera, and with the follow camera, you want to get the world location, and you also want to get the forward vector. So what's going on here? The world location is going to be the start point of line trace by channel, right? So it will start with wherever you define it, and it will end at a set range from the forward vector. So if you want to say like like X amount of feet in front of whatever actor reference or object reference you've got here, you would just multiply it by a float basically. So vector. So Right, so you want to multiply your vector by a float. This float will set to that number. That seems adequate enough, I believe, for an AK. Um, So this is going to get the forward vector, and this is going to be it's going to multiply it by a float, and then it's going to add it to the world location. So it's re-specifying again, not just the forward vector, but the forward vector plus the from the world location of the follow camera is where we want it. So it's just making it more clear as to where we want it to go. So what we do is we do a vector plus a vector, because our end result here is a vector and our end result here is a vector. So we'll get that. We'll just move these along a little bit. Try and fit it all on the screen. I really need to update my setup. But yeah, we get the world location and we plug it into there, and we essentially have combined these two values together to get an X amount of feet from in front of the follow camera, and we add that into the end location, right? For the draw debug type, I'd set that to none for now. If you follow this tutorial correctly, then it should work anyway, because I don't need to test this, it works. And obviously if there's any questions, I will be more than happy to answer or help anyone out who actually needs it. So with the line trace by channel, let's, we're going to move